Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where the shadows of history come alive and the darkest truths of the past are uncovered. Tonight, we bring you not just a crime, but perhaps the greatest betrayal in human history. A story soaked in ambition, fear, and blood, the assassination of Julius Caesar. It was not just the murder of a man, but the death of a republic, a crime so colossal that it changed the course of civilization forever. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling conspiracy, the betrayal by friends, and the final breath of Rome's most powerful leader. Rome was not just a city, but the beating heart of a civilization that ruled the known world. A place where triumphal arches rose to the heavens, and the Senate echoed with the voices of men who believed themselves destined to shape history. Yet beneath the grandeur, beneath the shining marble temples and bustling marketplaces, there was a city divided between admiration and fear, between the love of a leader and the terror of what his power could mean. Julius Caesar was no ordinary man. He was a soldier who had carved his name into eternity, with victories so dazzling that his fame outshone every rival. From Gaul to Egypt, his campaigns brought glory and riches that filled the coffers of Rome. But more than wealth, they brought something far more dangerous: unshakable loyalty from his legions, and unbreakable adoration from the people. The Roman citizens loved him as a savior, a champion of their cause, while his enemies in the Senate watched his rise with growing dread. It was this duality, worship on the streets and suspicion in the chambers, that created the storm that would soon consume the Republic. Rome had never been designed to be ruled by one man. It prided itself on being a republic where power was shared, where no single ruler could rise above the rest. The memory of kings was a wound that had never healed, and the word itself was poison in Roman politics. Yet Caesar, with every victory, with every reform, looked less like a servant of the state and more like a king in waiting. He wore his triumphs like a crown, and to many senators, every accolade, every honor he accepted was a step closer to monarchy. But Caesar was no fool. He knew the fear he inspired in the Senate, and he knew how to play the people like an instrument. He gave them bread, he gave them games, he gave them land and opportunities, and in return, they gave him their undying loyalty. To the common man, he was not a tyrant but a liberator, someone who challenged the arrogance of the Senate and cared for those left behind by Rome's endless wars and politics. Yet to the patricians, the elite families who had ruled for generations, he was a danger greater than any foreign enemy. His popularity was not their victory. It was their doom. The more the people adored him, the more desperate his enemies became. Senators whispered in corners, their words heavy with fear. What if Caesar declared himself king? What if the Republic was nothing but a mask, hiding the truth that Rome had already surrendered to one man? And worse, what if no one had the courage to stop him? These whispers spread like fire through the Senate, feeding the paranoia of men who once called Caesar their ally. They remembered how he had crossed the Rubicon with his army, defying tradition and law, daring to bring his legions into Italy itself. That single act had been enough to spark civil war, enough to make even the boldest senator realize that Caesar was not bound by the same rules as others. He had gambled everything and won, and now there seemed to be no limits left to his ambition. Yet ambition was only part of the fear. Caesar's reforms, while loved by the people, stripped the Senate of power. He filled offices with men loyal to him, reshaped the calendar, granted citizenship to many outside Rome, and restructured debts that had crushed the poor. Each change was another reminder that Caesar's vision for Rome placed him at the center, not the Senate. His authority stretched further than any consul, any dictator before him, and though he denied the title of king, his actions made the denial hollow. To many senators, it was no longer a question of if Caesar would make himself king, but when in taverns and forums, people shouted his name with pride, hailing him as Rome's greatest hero. In the Senate, Men debated with trembling voices, wondering how long before the republic they cherished became nothing more than a memory. It was not just fear of Caesar's power, but fear of their own irrelevance that drove them. Men who had spent their lives clawing for influence now stood in his shadow, powerless. Every decision, every law, seemed to flow through him, and the Senate, once the supreme body of Rome, was reduced to little more than spectators. This tension grew thicker with each passing day. On the streets, statues of Caesar were crowned with laurel wreaths. In the chambers of power, daggers of suspicion were being sharpened in silence. Some senators tried to flatter him, hoping to remain close to his glory, while others seethed, watching their republic slip away. It was in this atmosphere of admiration and terror that the first seeds of betrayal began to germinate. Men who smiled at Caesar in public, praising his greatness, whispered in secret meetings of how he must be stopped before it was too late. Caesar himself seemed untouchable, striding through Rome with the confidence of a man chosen by fate. He accepted honors, he accepted titles, and with each one, the Senate's fear deepened. The more they gave, the more he took, and soon, there was no balance left. To many, he was already king in everything but name. The question that haunted the minds of the senators was whether the republic could survive another season of Caesar's power. They feared not just for the state but for themselves, for once a king was crowned, who among them would remain safe from his wrath? Rome had always been a city of power struggles, but this was different. This was not senator against senator, or faction against faction. This was Rome itself against one man who had become larger than the republic. In the hearts of the people, he was a godlike figure. In the hearts of the Senate, he was a looming tyrant. And when fear mixes with ambition, when jealousy mixes with patriotism, the result is always the same conspiracy. The men who plotted against Caesar were not strangers lurking in the shadows, but men he had once trusted, men who had walked by his side through battles and victories, men who had benefited from his generosity and protection. This is what made their decision so chilling, for betrayal does not come from enemies, but from those closest to the heart. Among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, a figure whose name would forever be tied to treachery. Brutus was more than a senator, he was almost family. Caesar had favored him, trusted him, and even loved him like a son. To the people of Rome, Brutus was respected as a man of honor, a man who stood for the republic above all else. To the conspirators, he was the keystone of their plan, for without him, their act would be seen as nothing more than a bloody grab for power. But with him, they could disguise their blades with the illusion of patriotism. Beside Brutus was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man whose soul burned with envy. Cassius was no fool. He was a soldier of great skill, a leader in his own right, yet always overshadowed by Caesar. While Caesar's victories in Gaul brought glory and riches, Cassius watched from the sidelines, forced to accept a lesser role. Resentment grew inside him like poison, and when he looked at Caesar, he saw not a friend, but a tyrant who had stolen his chance at greatness. It was Cassius who fanned the flames of conspiracy, whispering that Caesar's ambition would be the death of the republic, that they must strike before it was too late. He understood that to kill Caesar was not enough, they needed legitimacy, and Brutus was the man who could provide it. So they began to gather in secret, meeting in dimly lit chambers away from the ears of Caesar's loyal supporters. Each man who joined carried his own reason, his own wound. Some feared Caesar's reforms that threatened their wealth and status. Others feared his growing titles, each one making him more powerful than the Senate itself. Some acted out of envy, unable to endure watching one man eclipse them all. Yet when they spoke together, they cloaked their motives in nobility, telling themselves they were defenders of liberty, protectors of Rome, saviors of the Republic. In truth, their cause was not pure. It was ambition dressed as patriotism, fear painted as courage. But history is often written by those who justify their crimes, and they would later claim they acted not for themselves, but for Rome. The plot needed more than words. It needed timing and precision. The Senate House would be their stage, for their Caesar would be surrounded by men he trusted, stripped of his loyal guards who remained outside. No battlefield, no legions, no loyal mob of citizens could protect him there. It was the perfect trap. They chose their day carefully, the Ides of March, the 15th day, when Caesar would attend the Senate meeting. It was a day already heavy with superstition, but for the conspirators, it was a day of opportunity. They sharpened their daggers, not just in metal but in resolve, preparing themselves for the act that would stain their names for eternity. Yet even among themselves, doubt lingered. To strike Caesar was not just to kill a man, it was to unleash chaos. Rome was held together by fragile threads, and Caesar was at the center of them all. Without him, there would be no balance, no order. The conspirators knew the people loved him, knew his death could spark riots and wars, but they convinced themselves it was worth the risk. Better to face civil strife than to live under a king. Better to plunge Rome into blood than allow one man to wear a crown. These were the thoughts they repeated to themselves, the lies they wrapped around their true motives. Cassius pressed hardest on Brutus, for without him, the plot could crumble. Brutus was torn between loyalty and duty, between love for Caesar and love for the Republic. Cassius reminded him of his ancestry, of his great ancestor Lucius Junius Brutus, who had once expelled Rome's kings and founded the Republic itself. He played on Brutus's sense of honor, convincing him that his bloodline demanded action, that history itself called upon him to rise against Caesar. And slowly, the mask of loyalty slipped from Brutus's face. He began to believe that killing Caesar was not betrayal, but sacrifice, that in plunging the dagger into Caesar's flesh, he would be saving Rome from tyranny. One by one, the conspirators pledged themselves to the cause. Names that once echoed with respect in the Senate became bound to a single bloody promise. They would strike together, so no single man could be blamed, so the guilt would be shared equally among them. They convinced themselves that unity would protect them, that if they all raised their blades, history would see not murderers but patriots. But beneath their oaths lay fear. Fear that if Caesar lived, their power would vanish. Fear that his reforms would strip them of everything they had fought for. Fear that Rome itself would no longer belong to them, but to the will of one man. The plan was simple, yet sinister. They would approach Caesar with petitions, encircle him with flattery, and then, at a signal, draw their daggers and strike. The first blow would surprise him, the next would weaken him, and together they would end him before he could call for help. In their minds, it would be quick, decisive, and glorious. Yet in truth, they underestimated not Caesar's strength, but the weight of betrayal itself. For when the moment came, they would not just be striking a man. They would be striking the very heart of Rome. The Ides of March loomed closer with every passing day, and with it, the tension in the conspirators' veins. Their faces remained calm in public, their words as polite as ever when speaking to Caesar. But behind closed doors, their hearts pounded with anticipation and dread. They knew they were preparing for more than murder. They were preparing for history's judgment. Some nights they doubted themselves, wondering if the people would rise against them, if their act would not save Rome but destroy it. Yet once the pact was made, there was no turning back. They had stepped into the shadows, and the only path forward was through blood. The morning of March 15th arrived heavy with an air that seemed to whisper warnings to anyone willing to listen. Rome awoke as it always did, with markets buzzing, voices rising in the streets, and senators preparing for yet another day of debate. But something unseen lingered in the city. It was as though the very stones of the forum knew that history was about to be written in blood. Caesar himself stirred uneasily, for the night had not been kind. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his murder, visions of his statue bleeding and Romans washing their hands in his blood. She woke trembling, clinging to him, begging him not to attend the Senate that day. Her tears and fear were unlike her usual composure, and for a moment, Caesar hesitated. He was a man of reason, but he was also a man who believed in signs, and these omens unsettled even his iron heart. Calpurnia's pleas grew desperate, urging him to stay home, to postpone the meeting. She reminded him of the soothsayer's warning that the Ides of March would bring danger, words Caesar had brushed aside as superstition. Yet now, with her eyes wide with dread, even he began to waver. He sent a message to the Senate, saying he would not attend, and for a short while, it seemed fate might be delayed. But fate is not so easily avoided, and soon Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators yet a man Caesar considered loyal, arrived at his home. Decimus mocked the idea of omens, telling Caesar that to stay away would make him appear weak, ruled by fear instead of reason. He flattered him, reminding him of the crown of glory he had always carried, telling him the Senate awaited his presence to honor him. Slowly, Caesar's pride overcame his caution. He could not allow himself to appear cowardly before men he had commanded, and so he resolved to go. As he stepped out, surrounded by attendants, the streets of Rome seemed normal, yet everything pointed toward the extraordinary. On his way, the soothsayer who had once warned him crossed his path. Caesar, half amused, called out, "The Ides of March are come," as if mocking fate itself. But the soothsayer replied quietly, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." The words lingered in the air like a shadow, yet Caesar pressed forward, dismissing them with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had faced armies, survived countless battles, and conquered nations. How could he fall here, in the heart of Rome, among men he believed to be friends? The theater of Pompey awaited, serving as the Senate house while the original was being restored. Its steps were crowded with senators dressed in their robes, their faces composed, though their hearts beat with anticipation and dread. They had rehearsed their roles, their daggers hidden beneath folds of cloth, their minds fixed on what was about to unfold. Caesar entered with his usual grace, greeted with bows and smiles, and he believed himself among allies. The conspirators closed in, a circle tightening around him, though disguised as respect. They held petitions in their hands, papers they pretended required his judgment, using them as an excuse to draw closer and closer. At first, everything was calm, almost ordinary. Senators leaned in, asking him to hear their requests, touching his arm, pressing closer with feigned urgency. Then came Tullius Caesar, thrusting a petition into Caesar's hands, begging for the pardon of his exiled brother. Caesar refused, brushing him off, but Caesar grew bolder, seizing Caesar's toga as though to plead. In that instant, the mask of civility fell away. Casca, another conspirator, stepped forward and struck the first blow, his dagger slicing into Caesar's shoulder. The wound was not mortal, but it was the signal. Chaos erupted as steel flashed in the dim light of the chamber. Daggers plunged again and again into Caesar's body, each conspirator eager to strike, to share the burden of the deed. Senators who had moments before bowed in respect now lunged at him like wolves tearing into prey. Caesar fought at first, shocked by the suddenness, striking back with his hands, his strength still formidable despite his age. But the blows came too fast, too many. The room filled with the sound of steel against flesh, of robes tearing, of Caesar's voice crying out in confusion and pain. And then came the moment that has echoed through centuries. Wounded and staggering, Caesar turned and saw Brutus among them, the man he loved most, the man he had trusted beyond reason. His eyes locked on Brutus's, and all the strength drained from him, not from blood loss alone, but from heartbreak. "Et tu, Brute?" The words slipped from his lips, not in anger, but in disbelief, in sorrow deeper than any wound. If even Brutus could betray him, then resistance was futile. In that instant, Caesar ceased to fight, covering his face with his toga, surrendering to the storm of blades. The conspirators stabbed until his body could bear no more. 23 wounds carved into his flesh. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling at the feet of his old rival, as though fate itself had chosen the cruelest irony. Around him stood the senators, their daggers dripping, their robes stained crimson. Silence fell in the chamber, broken only by their ragged breaths, the enormity of what they had done sinking into their bones. They looked not at each other, but at the lifeless body of the man they had called tyrant, the man who had been Rome's greatest general, now reduced to a bleeding corpse on the marble floor. In those moments, the Senate House no longer felt like a chamber of law but a temple of murder. The men who had plotted in secret now stood in the open, exposed not only to Rome but to history itself. Their blades were hidden once more, their hands trembling, but there was no undoing the act. Caesar, the man who had crossed oceans, toppled kings and reshaped the Republic, had fallen not by the might of foreign armies, but by the hands of those he trusted most. The lifeless body of Julius Caesar lay sprawled at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood slowly spreading across the marble floor like a dark tide consuming everything it touched. The men who had sworn themselves protectors of the Republic stood around him, daggers still wet in their trembling hands, their breaths shallow and their eyes fixed on the figure they had just destroyed. For a moment there was silence, a silence so deep it felt unnatural, broken only by the sound of fabric dragging against stone as Caesar's toga settled around him. The conspirators had imagined that his death would bring relief, a sense of triumph, but instead the air was heavy with dread. They were men who had believed themselves saviors, yet as they gazed upon his broken form, they could not escape the truth of what they had done. They had murdered Rome's most powerful man, in cold blood. Outside the chamber, the city still bustled, unaware of the storm that had just shattered its heart. The conspirators gathered themselves quickly, attempting to steady their shaking hands and blood-stained robes, preparing to walk into the streets as though heroes returning from victory. They thought the people would understand, that they would see the daggers not as instruments of treachery, but as tools of liberty. With Brutus at the forefront, they believed they could cloak their crime in the language of freedom, convincing the masses that Caesar's death was necessary, that they had struck not against a man but against tyranny itself. Yet reality was never so simple, and as they emerged from the Senate House with pride forced upon their faces, the city did not erupt in cheers. Instead, fear spread like fire, whispers racing through the crowds, uncertainty gripping every Roman heart. The body of Caesar was left abandoned on the marble floor, a chilling testament to betrayal. For hours, it lay where it fell, as though even his enemies feared to move him, as though the weight of his presence clung to the space even in death. When at last loyal followers retrieved him, his wounds, 23 in total, were revealed. In their horror, Rome wept at the sight of its leader torn apart, not by enemies on the battlefield, but by those who had sat at his side in the Senate. His blood had soaked into the stone, and with it, the Republic itself seemed to bleed away. The conspirators tried to speak of liberty, of restoring the Republic, but their words rang hollow. The people did not see noble defenders of freedom. They saw murderers who had cut down the man who fed them, who gave them land, who brought them victories beyond imagining. The very men who had hoped to win honor now found themselves cursed with shame. Their daggers had silenced Caesar, but they had awakened something far more dangerous, the fury of the Roman people and the hunger for vengeance. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and general, stepped into the chaos with eyes burning not with fear, but with calculation. He had survived the day only because the conspirators had spared him, believing he could be won over or neutralized. But Antony was not a man to be so easily dismissed. He walked into the chamber where Caesar's body had been left, fell to his knees, and clasped the lifeless hand of the man who had been his leader. In that moment, He swore to the silent corpse that Rome would not forgive, that Caesar's blood would not be the final word. Antony's grief was real, but his ambition was sharper than any blade. And in the death of Caesar, he saw both tragedy and opportunity. The funeral of Caesar was no quiet affair, but an eruption of grief that shook the foundations of Rome. His body, burned upon a massive pyre in the Forum, became the symbol of both love and rage. Antony's speech, filled with sorrow and fire, stoked the emotions of the people, turning mourning into fury. He did not openly condemn the conspirators at first, but he did not need to. By pointing to Caesar's wounds, by holding aloft his blood-stained toga, he reminded Rome of the brutality of the crime. When the crowd saw the gashes that pierced the fabric, when they remembered the kindness Caesar had shown them, the city exploded in rage. They rioted, they sought vengeance, and the men who had called themselves liberators found themselves hunted like criminals. The conspirators had thought Caesar's death would bring peace, but instead it brought war. Civil strife consumed the Republic, tearing families and factions apart. Brutus and Cassius fled, gathering armies to fight for their survival, but their cause was already poisoned by the stain of betrayal. They were hunted not only by Antony, but by Octavian, Caesar's young heir, who rose with a determination that stunned even seasoned veterans. The Republic that the conspirators claimed to protect collapsed under the weight of their crime, and the wars that followed ended not in freedom but in empire. Rome no longer belonged to senators or conspirators. It belonged to emperors, and the Republic was gone forever. The murder of Julius Caesar was not the preservation of liberty, but the destruction of it. The men who struck him down had convinced themselves that his ambition would enslave Rome, yet it was their ambition, their daggers, that enslaved Rome to the destiny of empire. By spilling his blood, they did not restore the Republic, they buried it. From the ashes of civil war rose Augustus, the first emperor, and with him, the age of emperors began. And so the Ides of March became more than a date. It became a warning, carved into the memory of history. It was the day when trust was shattered, when friendship was twisted into betrayal, when a republic died at the hands of its own guardians. Caesar's last breath was not merely the end of a man but the end of an era. The conspirators believed their crime would save Rome, but in truth, it destroyed the very thing they claimed to protect. This was the assassination that ended a republic and gave birth to an empire. This was history's greatest betrayal.